Hey guys, it's the Melblade 5, and it's no secret that I love Persona 5 so much because I don't shut up about it. It was my first Persona game, having next to no knowledge on the series beforehand and not even sure of what to expect of 5 itself as I didn't see most of the trailers. And upon starting the game, I quickly fell in love with it because of its gameplay, strategy, characters, story, themes, music, like everything! It's not a perfect game, but it sure felt like one to me for the vast majority of my playtime. And while I haven't played any of the other mainline Persona games, not even the Steam port of 4 because I'm not a PC gamer, I've gone the extra mile to experience everything related to 5, with the exception of the dancing game because that's not my thing, and Scramble because I'm waiting for a hopeful English release before playing it. But amongst the wider Persona 5 media, there is currently an absent spin-off idea that I really want to see become a reality, which is a Persona 5 Arena. I had vaguely heard about Persona 4 Arena before playing 5, but I didn't really get to see it in action until afterwards, and from knowing that 5 was likely going to get the same treatment of getting tons of spin-offs at that time, I immediately wanted them to do this, and it is still my most wanted spin-off. A fighting game with 5's cast? Hell yes! But after all this time, there hasn't been anything at all about this actually happening. I don't even think it's going to happen at this point since the 2D half of Arc System Works is still working on BlazBlue Cross Tag Battle.
Isn't it time you just called it a day? No one will mourn.
This saddens me a bit considering I have had so many cool ideas for what they could do with this concept ever since I first thought about it. However, seeing as there's been a recent rise in these hypothetical fighting game videos, I decided to finally present all those ideas myself to put it out there. This concept goes a bit beyond what a bog standard version of similar types of videos do, as it will cover several aspects of what I envision this game to be like. And of course, I am going to be realistic with my ideas from both a development and writing perspective, rather than presenting a ton of outlandish suggestions that'll never happen. Who knows? Maybe someone with connections to Arc Systems will see this and hook me up to direct the game. But now I am getting outlandish. I'll just get to it. So I begin with the most important aspect of a fighting game, other than the gameplay. The roster. For this section, I'm going to mention every playable character and give a brief overview on how each of them would fight by giving any ideas I had for their playstyle, their moves, and even their insta-kills where appropriate. First up is, well, obviously, Joker. Or since this is a spin-off, he'll be called Ren Amamiya. I still don't like that name. Being the protagonist, he'd most likely be an all-around fighter with a slight leaning towards the lightweight and nimble side. Dealing a lot of fast, light damage with good combo potential by stabbing and slashing opponents with his knife, shooting from a distance with his gun, and using Arsene's curse skills for additional projectile attacks, whilst the stronger skills like A-Gown can be utilized for specials. Basically, it would be pretty similar to his Smash Bros moveset, just appropriately translated to a traditional 2D fighting game. And he had the easiest idea for an insta-kill to think of. Use insta-kill in 4 had Izanagi transform into Izanagi no Okami. So Joker's has Arsene turn into Saturnile and use Sinful Shell on the target. Then going in the order they are recruited, the next is Morgana. He would be far along the spectrum of being lightweight and speedy, cause he's a cat. He'd definitely be the shortest character in the game, which would lead to an odd job effect with his hitbox, but that could be the upside in return for him likely having very low defense. Morgana's attacks would also be pretty light hitting, but also have strong combo potential too. Then he can use some of Zoro's wind skills to disrupt, stun, and or blow away opponents to add a small element of strategy to his playstyle, and Zoro could also use his own swordsmanship to make up for Morgana's more weaker attacks in his specials, such as performing a strong, single-hit sword thrust as a combo ender. For his insta-kill, the idea I had was for him to transform into his bus form and just run over the opponent repeatedly, just like his follow-up attack. As for Ryuji, he'd be more on the opposite side by hitting harder with his lead pipe and other blunt weapons, whilst being slightly slower. His regular moves can include swings with the pipe such as overheads and a batter swing like in his follow-up, a blast from his shotgun that does more damage at close range, and having Captain Kidd use Zio to bring down a lightning strike at the opponent's location. One of his specials can have Captain Kidd ram into the opponent with potentially another move utilizing his boat as a shield. The only idea I could think of for his insta-kill is to involve Captain Kidd firing an electric laser beam from his arm cannon. Next, as Morgana would say, is the lovely Lady Ann. I picture Ann as being the closest thing to a ranged fighter amongst the group, given her arsenal, as she can strike with her whip, shoot with her machine gun, and use Carmen to launch fireballs like she does in animated form. Potentially you could incorporate Carmen's sleep skills as a way to stun the opponent and leave them open to follow-ups. And given that her Phantom Thief attire is supposed to be like a dominatrix, I imagine that at least her grabs would reference the, kinky things they do to make the others submit. Likewise for her insta-kill, just some extreme dominatrix stuff. Then for Yusuke, he'd clearly be another one on the nimble side since his look and persona are kinda ninja-like. His melee moves would mostly consist of quick, precise katana slashes to further reflect the symbolism on why he has one with how it relates to his artistry. But I guess some could have a slight startup animation to go all in on katana combat. For how they would use Goemon, one would probably be to just whack the opponent with his smoke pipe, as that's how I imagine he uses his physical skills, and shoot an ice blast as a projectile-based special. Building on that, my clear idea for the insta-kill is for Goemon to unleash a blizzard that freezes the opponent, and then Yusuke uses his follow-up attack on them. It's literally an insta-kill in the game, so it makes the most sense to fulfill that role here. He even does a similar thing in his Awakening battle in the manga. Also, an idea I had for his victory animation was to start sketching up an idea for a painting based on the fight. Now moving on to Best Girl, Makoto. She'd be the opposite of Ann, as she would almost exclusively focus on close-range combat given her knuckle weapons and fighting style. She'd be the closest thing this game has to a grappling character, as they could even incorporate some Aikido moves. At least I think it's largely based around grappling. It wasn't the martial art I learned. When including your skills, she could also use Fray, mimicking the same animation from the game, to create the ball a short distance in front of her that explodes shortly after as a setup for combos. Then with her specials, she too can run people over using Johanna for a strong single-hit attack, and maybe Flash Bomb for another one? Makoto was also another I had a very easy time thinking of an insta-kill for. She uses Fray, but this time charges it up while she drives away on Johanna, then releases it to create a giant explosion resembling the animation for Freydyne. Next, with a slightly odd pick, is Futaba. But Futaba is the navigator, she doesn't fight! Well, they made Rise playable in Ultimax, and I think you could easily come up with a moveset for Futaba from looking at her persona abilities. Futaba would be a very technical character. Her hacking could be used to inflict debuffs and other negative effects on the opponent, as well as planting traps for them to hopefully set off. One of her specials could even create the ballista used in the Cognitive Wakaba battle and fire it. And for moves that would directly involve Necronomicon, it could drop a bomb near the opponent that explodes shortly thereafter to reference her all-out attack in Royal, and possibly use the tentacles to grab the opponent, locking them in place to give an opportunity to use her hacking. Then her insta-kill could be similar to Teddy's, in which the opponent is trapped inside Necronomicon, it flies away, and then explodes with them in it. And then we have Haru, who would most likely be the tank character of this game. Her attacks would be kinda slow, like how she struggles to swing her axe, but they do a lot of damage like what you'd expect from a giant axe and a grenade launcher for her arsenal. Milady can back her up from the projectile side of things with her vagina guns, as I call them, with some attacks using her psychokinetic skills too, such as a special that uses Sayo, where, mimicking the animation again, it creates a bunch of balls around the opponent that fly inwards to deal multiple hits. Plus, I even thought of her using both Tetracon and Makaracon simultaneously as a shield and counter merged together, similar to how the skills work in Smash Bros. And for her insta-kill, she could unleash Milady's full artillery, most notably the Gatling guns, before finishing off with the big missile she has in the center. That's all of the Phantom Thieves, but there's still characters outside of the group that can be playable, most notable of all being Akechi. From when he was pretending to work with the Thieves, I see him being an all-around fighter too, but even more so than Joker. He'd also have a balanced mix of close range and projectile attacks, using moves like swinging his beam sword for the former, and Robin Hood shooting a giant arrow and using his blessing curse skills for the latter. But there is something very important about Akechi I need to address, being that he's kinda dead. Well, as far as vanilla P5 is concerned at least, and Scramble appears to follow on more from the original rather than Royal. This is jumping the gun and going a bit into my idea for the story for this game, but my explanation for his appearance is that this is not the same Akechi from the game. Rather, it is a cognitive version of him, like what was seen in Shido's palace, but this one is created from the Phantom Thieves' memories of him, as this would take place in a world that follows similar logic to the metaverse. This explanation also leads into the next character for the roster, which is Dark Akechi, now using Loki. Akechi fights very differently in both these states that you could make them separate characters whilst not being clones. This is a result of the conflicting feelings the Thieves have for Akechi following his demise. On one hand, they felt sympathy for him because of the horrible things he went through that drove him crazy, and feel guilt for not being able to save him from himself and Shido. But on the other, they can't forgive him for all the people he's killed and made suffer. As such, the cognitive version of Akechi in this world is split into two people. The Akechi before he showed his true colors that reflects the part in which he could have somewhat redeemed himself, and Akechi as the black mask to reflect the part they still hate. Dark Akechi would fully display how psychotic he is, like in Royal's first semester, being a character who rushes in head first and wants to be up close so he can mutilate his enemies. Using far more violent attacks with his jagged sword, more usage of his gun since he loves using it like this, and having Loki swing down his giant sword. Loki would also unleash strong curse skills and use Riot Gun to bring down lightning for one of his specials. I even thought of a move where he uses Desperation on himself to raise his attack but lower his defense. And his insta-kill would just be him tearing his opponent to shreds as they become silhouettes to cover up the gore, like what he does in his and Joker's Showtime. Plus, I can picture both Akechis having interesting intro dialogue when they face off against each other. Following on from this game likely taking place after Persona 5, the next character is Lavenza. Taking a similar approach to what they did with Margaret in 4, she would have access to multiple personas across her moveset, primarily being those that are utilized by Carolyn and Justine in their boss fight, and herself in her boss fight in Royal. But to make it more unique compared to Margaret and the other fighters here, some of her attacks can reference the different executions performed in the Velvet Room. For example, her grab could trap you in the electric chair, one of her moves could drop the guillotine blade on you, and most notably, some of her melee attacks could have her use the fucking chainsaw, dealing multiple hits to the opponent. And for her insta-kill, it would be combining how she automatically wins in both boss fights. She summons Ardor to create a shockwave, and if the opponent is hit by it, they are knocked down. She then splits back into Carolyn and Justine and beats you with an all-out attack. And the last newcomer that I'll cover in this section is an original character! Most Persona spin-offs introduce original characters, and the arena games are no exception, with Labris in the original 4 arena and Sho Minazuki in Ultimax. This character's moveset would largely rely on whatever their persona would be, so I can't say with much confidence how they would fight. Though we haven't had a persona based on a cowboy, or more accurately a Wild West outlaw, just saying. It would also be unclear on if this character would be an ally or an enemy. Personally, I envision them leaning more towards Sho and being an antagonist, so there would be more conflict in the story. My idea for them is to awaken their persona partway through the story, and then use that power to try and create chaos to get back at the society that has screwed them over so harshly. That's all the new characters. Before also brought back the characters from Persona 3, now aged up a bit. So I'm pretty confident that a 5 arena would feature characters from 3 and 4 in the same manner, with the age increase being the most apparent with the 4 characters who would now have their ultimate personas too. So for the rest of the section, I'll go over the returning characters and why I chose them, as they would likely play the same as before but with several tweaks. Starting with Persona 4, I had a lot of trouble with this because Inaba is a countryside town, so I think it would be pretty contrived to have most of the investigation team just happening to be in Tokyo when the game's events kick off. So all of my choices here were honestly based on who would be the easiest to write into the story with what's already established about them, as I don't want to completely make up what they'd be doing 5 years later, as that's really Atlas's call, and they could do anything they want. By far the easiest character from 4 to fit in the story is Naoto, as she's a detective who mostly works outside of Inaba before and after the game. So you could say she's investigating a case related to the Phantom Thieves or why she's in Tokyo, and her working for the police could create some conflict between her and the thieves in the story. They could even take a bit of influence from her own spin-off novel for her appearance and personality. I know it wasn't well received, but they could look at some of the better aspects, if there are any. Plus, she's even mentioned in 5, so they do acknowledge her, and you could have a unique intro dialogue with both Akechis to play on how they're both detective princes. Then the second easiest one would be Rise, as she too works outside of Inaba and is referenced in 5. Being an idol, you could just come up with an explanation that she had a concert in Tokyo at the same time the story kicks off. I believe she also appears in the Naoto novel, so again, they could take some inspiration from that for how her personality has changed. And then I really struggled with finding ways to include another investigation team member, since the others have strong commitments to their homes. Unless I want to say something like Kanji is such a simp for Naoto that he stalked her here. The only one I could think of anything for, and this is a stretch, is Teddy, by giving some arbitrary reason of him somehow being warped from the TV world to this new metaverse-like world. However, I had a much simpler time thinking of which C's members to bring back, even if it is a little uncreative. The ones who appeared in the original arena. Mitsuru, Akihiko, and Aigis. Their involvement with the Shadow Operatives made it easy to include them because they could be sent in to figure out what's going on with the supernatural events of the story. And then I had one more character from 3 to bring back with Elizabeth, because I needed one more person for the base roster. But she is very popular, and I felt having another Velvet Room attendant would help expand their involvement in the story, which is why I specifically chose her. That's all for the base roster. But of course, this is a fighting game, so there's going to be DLC. These characters won't have any presence in the story, which relieved some stress on who to pick, but they could still be given a personal, brief story in arcade mode. For potential new characters that would likely be introduced as DLC, while I took influence from Royal with some moves, we're going full-on Royal now, so for the third time, I have to issue a spoiler warning. The first is definitely Sumire, no explanation needed. They can incorporate some of her gymnastic techniques for dodges and aerial attacks, and for more specific moves, Sanjian can perform strong bless attacks like Kogan to bring down an arrow of light, sword dance to skewer the opponent in place, and possibly even brave step to grant her a chance of getting a critical hit that does more damage. I'm also going to double dip on Royal by including someone who's a bit out there. Maruki. He is a Persona user, so it makes sense. Maruki would probably be a slow, ranged character, but one that can deal major damage when used right, with many of his moves using Azathoth's tendrils and weaker versions of attacks from his boss fight, with his insta-kill making Azathoth transform into Adam Cadmon to Falcon Punch the opponent, all while appearing in his cosplay as the World. Plus, there's a ton of potential for his interactions, where when facing off against the 3 and 4 characters, he can state what he'd do to end their pain in his reality, such as letting Akihiko see Shinjiro again, or making it so that Teddy was never a shadow in the first place. I think that would be some cool fan service. The last DLC idea I had, and this is another big stretch, is Sophia. Atlus has had some characters who originated in the spin-offs return in other games, so I think it would be cool to include Scramble with its main original character. And you wouldn't struggle coming up with a moveset, as they can take all her attacks in that game and translate them to 2D space. The only possible issue with adding Sophia is that I believe when it comes to Musou crossover games that Koei Tecmo own the rights to all the original characters. I definitely know that's the case with Hyrule Warriors and Fire Emblem Warriors, but as they're the only ones I played, I don't know if this applies elsewhere. But it's also possible that Atlus could make a deal with Koei Tecmo to use Sophia if that's the case. They could also add other characters from Scramble as more DLC, but as I said before, I haven't played the game, so I don't know what happens. And don't you dare post spoilers in the comments or I'll never forgive you! So that is the entire playable cast. While the base roster is smaller than Ultimax's, it is mostly composed of completely brand new characters, so I think it balances out. So now I'll go over the next major section of this game, which is focused entirely on the story. While Persona 4 Arena and Ultimax featured character stories, which divided the narrative across each fighter's perspective, I would want what most modern fighting games do and have one single story mode that encompasses the entire plot and has you switch to different characters when appropriate. Whenever I presented a story of my own before, it was always a rework of a pre-existing story, not one made from scratch. So I don't really have any ideas for the exact nitty-gritty details and specific plot points of the story, rather a general overview that covers the key points like what I did with the characters. So that's what I'll do here. The story begins with numerous police reports of people in Tokyo randomly going missing. Naoto, who was already in Tokyo to assist the police with investigating the Phantom Thieves, is now investigating these disappearances too because she thinks there could be a connection. As the disappearances become more and more frequent, in typical superhero movie fashion, a giant portal appears in the sky which bridges the real world with this other world that works similarly to the metaverse. Essentially, this world is one giant palace, with the distortion being that Tokyo is viewed as one giant fighting arena, with the people who disappeared having been abducted here and forced to fight each other. This world belongs to a powerful entity who wishes to create complete chaos by embracing the suffering and conflict that occurs in the real world, and plans to inevitably abduct every single person into its palace to see them all fight for its own amusement. Upon the portal opening, Naoto, Rise, and Teddy all get abducted and end up meeting up with one another. The Phantom Thieves investigate the portal and willingly decide to infiltrate this palace to stop all this. And shortly thereafter, the Shadow Operatives come to research this event, which is how Mitsuru, Akihiko, and Aigus get swept up in this too. Within the other world, this entity takes advantage of the people's painful memories to recreate those past experiences, to deceive and in some cases even brainwash them into fighting others, sometimes fighting amongst themselves. This plays a part into characters from different factions fighting each other, in addition to simply not trusting them most of the time, as well as why characters within the same group would end up fighting. It's also how the entity would create the cognitive versions of Akechi. Meanwhile, the original character for this game would be one of the people who were abducted prior to the portal opening, and are introduced fairly early on as a person who is scared out of their mind from all the violence, in addition to detailing how they have suffered in the past. The entity then takes advantage of this by forcefully bringing them back memories of those moments and placing them face to face with someone who played a major role in making their life hell. This causes them to awaken their persona and adopt the entity's desire to create chaos by eliminating all people with positions of power in this world to make real-world society collapse. Then while all this is going on, Lavenza, as well as Elizabeth operating from the shadows, are trying to push the heroes from all groups towards the right path to cooperate with one another. This ultimately works, as the final act involves the heroes teaming up and performing one big heist to steal the treasure, whilst having to fight the entity who is the final boss for both the story and arcade modes. Whew! That's the two big sections out of the way. The only other thing I wanted to specifically mention is the stages, which I don't have many ideas for, but wanted to explain how they could push the idea of Tokyo being turned into a fighting arena with their design. The two ideas I had for this was for one to definitely be Shibuya Crossing, but with the road being made of clay with white markings on the ground, and having wooden barriers at the side with cognitive spectators watching, to have the whole thing resemble a sumo ring. Then the second is to have a subway station, but it is repurposed to look like a cage match by having bars set up at the side. I also think it would be cool to have the Velvet Room as a stage, rather than just being relegated to menus. And that was everything I wanted to say. There would obviously be other modes like online, which would have the standard ranked and free play matches, maybe something like a King of the Hill mode too, and then I guess there's options. But I don't really have anything to say about those, so I'll end it here. If a Persona 5 Arena did somehow happen, it would likely be very different to what I thought of here in most, if not all aspects. but I wanted to give an idea for what one could be like for fun, and possibly to see if anyone else is on board with that idea. I mean, I've had some of these concepts planned out in my mind for the past 2 to 3 years, so part of me is relieved to have finally said these things out loud. But like the majority of my Smash Bros. Concepts, I'm fully expecting this idea to never happen.